Women in the military. History tells us what humanity has overcome in the past. It is a story, one that is not pleasing or kind to certain groups, especially women. History often presents a bloody, chancy, and disconcerting picture of life regarding the roles and freedoms of women. While this picture is not always entirely accurate, one point stands out. Women in America have always served the interest of their country. During the early settlement of North America, women immigrated to colonial and frontier America by necessity, accepting a rigorous life of the unknown, fighting the elements and the enemy for survival. Many of these women used the lessons learned from immigrating and applied their experiences by going to war with their husbands, or in some cases, eventually wearing the uniforms themselves. These women accomplished incredible feats of service regardless of the dangerous and unknown future ahead of them. While it is true that many women stayed behind to manage and maintain the home front and sent their fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons off to fight in the war of the time, many women and families also traveled with their men and became camp followers. These camp followers encouraged the domesticity of living for the soldiers. They served as laundresses, seamstresses, nurses, cooks, and even in some cases were prostitutes. Women played a small but significant role during the American Revolution. Traditional roles included nurses, seamstresses, and cooks. However, these occupations were not all they did. We have the Molly Pritchard legend, which states that upon the wounding of her husband, Molly manned her husband's gun at the Battle of Monmouth, aiding the rebels' victory over the British. Pritchard's legend might not be as true as we think it is. Rather than being about a single woman, the Molly's story is a compilation of the actions of multiple women at the time. A notable name that you will recognize is Abigail Adams, who served as a spy. Another example of a woman who stepped across a line and into service was Deborah Sampson, who enlisted in the Army under her dead brother's name, Robert Shurtleff, and upon the discovery of her sex, she received her discharge from the Army. While these are just two examples of women who left their mark on the activities of the American Revolutionary War, countless other women appear in documented history. In addition, many others did not get the recognition in history that they deserve. We see the same through the Civil War and the Spanish-American War. Women continued to fulfill their traditional roles of maintaining the home front and as nurses, cooks, and seamstresses. Almost 3 decades after the American Revolution, Americans found themselves at war again with the War of 1812. The War of 1812 appears to be an American war not much talked about. However, while the roles of women did not change much from the previous conflict, we can see slightly more documented experiences of Native American Indian women taking part within this contention with England. However, during the Civil War, we saw an uptick of women who disguised themselves as men to enlist in the Army. Women made their greatest contributions to the Civil War in the field of medicine. One of the things that the Civil War challenged was the culture of the Victorian domesticity. These ideals define the roles of men and women, with the amount of women disguising themselves as men to serve in both the Union and Confederate armies. The experience of these women helped to redefine what womanhood looked like in America. Along with the traditional roles of women serving alongside the military, the women of the time set up aid relief societies. In the Union Army, these societies provided them with food, clothing, and other necessities. These women were pivotal in petitioning the federal government to create the United States Sanitary Commission. This commission was established to combat preventable diseases and make conditions better by following the work of Florence Nightingale. The women of the Confederate Army also chartered aid and relief societies. However, the difference between these societies is that the Confederate Army had fewer resources and therefore were more dependent upon the ladies' auxiliaries. We must not forget the contributions of slaves and freed women. History does not always recognize the names and pictures of these women, as we do with Harriet Tubman, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a nurse, and a Union spy. During the Spanish-American War, the Army could not recruit the roughly 6,000 men needed to serve as nurses, so they reluctantly accepted 1,500 women as nurses under a civilian contract. The Spanish-American War had convinced some in the government that women could serve in the military. The Spanish-American War yet again saw women serving as nurses and in relief efforts. However, with this war, we can start to see a shift in the way the women of the time engage in support of the military. We can see new groups starting to pop up, like the Women's National War Relief Association, the Spanish Red Cross, and the Cuban White Cross. Women started reporting on the way. A Canadian, Kathleen Blake Coleman, is credited as the first female war correspondent in the world. We also see that women started being more vocal in their opinions and started to participate in public discussions. During World War I, the Secretary of the Navy became convinced that the enlistment of women was essential to meet the manpower requirements for the Navy and Marines. For the first time, women enlisted into the military as Navy yeomanettes and Marines. They served primarily as nurses, clerks, and communication operators. They served in the United States as well as abroad from 1898 to 1901. General Pershing requested 5,000 military women to support the military in Europe. The War Department refused to enlist women, but instead recruited 5,000 unskilled men and 5,000 women as volunteers. Since they were volunteers, Pershing had no administrative controls and no legal power over them, making them completely unmanageable. The Army War Department issued this statement: "With careful supervision, women employees may be permitted in camps with no moral injury either to themselves or to the soldiers. For example, at Camp Grant, near Fort Sheridan, Illinois, student nurses were carefully segregated from men. They obviously believed in physical fitness, though in this photo, the Camp Grant student nurses did drill and ceremony in uniforms borrowed from men because uniforms were not provided for women. During World War I, women received much of the same training as men, whether it is in parades, at hospitals, or in gas chambers, as in this photo taken at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Women, of course, served overseas. Beyond their traditional roles, women also served as radio operators, messengers, stenographers, clerks, truck drivers, ordnance workers, telephone operators, and many other non-combat roles. In 1917, when America entered the war, the former National American Women's Suffrage Association president, Anna Howard Shaw, was fundamental in marshaling women for service. Along with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, other like organizations stood up and worked towards making sure that women were still women and to step up and help fill the gaps on the home front that were left by the men going off to the European theater. Women serving in uniform during World War I looked very different in other countries. Russia had a women's battalion of death founded by Maria Bashkarova. Bulgaria and Romania are just two other examples of where women were allowed to serve as combat troops. Following the war, at the Armistice Parade in Paris, American Red Cross nurses, led by Colonel Julia Stimson, 1st Army Nurse Corps Chief, proudly marched in the celebration of the Allied victory. During the interwar period, women generally were not part of the American military. This return to so-called normalcy was punctuated by some planners, such as Anita Phipps, who was employed by the War Department to demonstrate the Army's meager interest in women, and Major Everett Hughes. an early planner who recommended incorporating vast number of women into the military. There was much discussion about the use of women during World War II. This poster portrays them in their traditional roles, an operator talking to the boys in uniform. Major Hughes's Women Army Air Corps was signed into law in May 1942 as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. As Congress considered the passage of the WAC bill, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall recognized the need for women to meet manpower shortages. Here is the cover from a magazine article on the 1st WAC Battalion at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The sentiments of the opposition are clearly expressed by a congressman who said, "I think it is a reflection on the courageous manhood of the country to pass a law inviting women to join the armed forces in order to win a battle. Take the women into the armed service, who then will do the cooking, the washing, the mending, and the humble, homey tasks to which every woman has devoted herself. Think of the humiliation. What has become of the manhood of America?" In contrast, note the comment of Albert Speer, Hitler's weapons production chief. "How wise you were to bring your women into your military and into your labor force. Had we done that initially as you did, it could have well affected the course of the war. We would have found out, as you did, that women were equally effective and for some skills superior to males." From the beginning of the auxiliary status, the WAC did not work. There were disadvantages for the women. They did not receive equal pay to their male counterparts. They did not receive entitlement for dependents as the men did. They had no rank. Overseas, they did not have the same legal protection as men. However, publicity still focused on the traditional women's role. In this photo, you can see a WAC getting her hair done, WACs playing games, in a shower, almost like a soap commercial. Notice her lipstick stays on in the shower, or WACs as bathing beauties, or in romantic interludes with GIs. In June 1943, because of the problems of auxiliary status, the WAC was converted to the Women's Army Corps. They had a new organization, but the same roles. Women worked at the mess hall and worked in the motor pool. You can still see the romanticized viewpoint that the WAC used to recruit women. Overseas, women continued in auxiliary roles. Notice, rather than combat, women were featured here attending religious services. Although black women were allowed in the WAC, for example, 400 whites and 40 black women were selected from 30,000 applicants. Like their male counterparts, they were kept in segregated units. The media referred to the Army women as wackies and concentrated on bras and bosoms. Some of the media coverage suggested scandalous, immoral behavior overseas. American women served wherever the war took place. They did on the beaches of Anzano and Normandy. Here, women arrived close behind the front lines a few weeks after the invasion of Normandy. World War II institutionalized the role of women in the military, with the signing of the Women's Armed Service Integration Act, which President Truman signed into law on June 12, 1948. Even though many women served in uniform during World War II, many stayed at home and went to fill the jobs that the men left behind. We have Rosie the Riveter, who became an icon and helped spark women out of the home and into the workplace, breaking previous social mores and social norms. Just 2 years after the end of World War II, America found itself at war yet again when we went to South Korea on June 25, 1950. A parallel that we can see unfolding before and during the Korean War is the desegregation of blacks and whites in the armed forces, as well as the integration of women into the military. According to the Korean War Legacy Foundation, there were 120,000 women on active duty status during this time, and that 1/3 of them were healthcare providers. On July 27, 1953, the Korean War was over. Even though this was the first war with integration and desegregation, these were just the start of changes for women in the military. Yet again, 2 years after we finish one war, we move into another, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is probably one of the most opposed wars in American history, and that opposition kept growing over time. Outside of the military, American culture was making its own shift, which was influencing the view on this war as a whole, not just how it applies to women who served. Looking back over time, it appears safe to say that during Vietnam, women's jobs within the military started to diversify. Most of the uniformed women were nurses, but some were serving as air traffic controllers and intelligence officers. During Vietnam, 7,500 military and civilian women served from 1965 until the drawdown that started in 1973. Women in all services distinguished themselves in Vietnam. Many were decorated, some injured, and some died. The 1970s saw a sharp increase in the number of women in the military, reflecting the impact of the women's rights movement. Remarkably, most of the women that served in Vietnam volunteered. 1967 brought about the repeal of the 2% cap placed on women serving and lifted the restriction of the highest rank that a woman could achieve within the Air Force. From 1968 to 1981, there was a six-fold increase in the number of women in the Army, going from 10,000 to 65,000. The 1970s saw a multitude of changes for women in the military. In 1973, a Supreme Court ruling in favor of Air Force Lieutenant Sharon Frontiero, which authorized military women with dependents, housing, medical, commissary, and post-exchange benefits. 1973 also saw the Secretary of the Navy authorize aviation training for women. The first female flight surgeon was appointed. A women's officer school was disestablished and pregnancy rules established. In 1975, a huge shift came for women in uniform when they could remain on active duty while pregnant. This change is owed to now retired Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Hines Smith. In 1976, the first women cadets entered into the service academies, and the Air Force dissolved the Women in the Air Force. 2 years later, in 1978, the Army disestablished the WAC, and women were integrated into the military on equal footing with men. Women entered aviation training and were admitted to command organizations. The 1990s saw female pilots flying combat missions when U.S. Secretary of Defense Les Aspin Jr. revised the policy on the assignment of women in the armed forces. The tragic events that took place on September 11, 2001, had a momentous impact on women's service in the military and the American society as a whole. While this day was not the first terrorist attack on America, it was the first for a whole new generation. As the country grieved and dealt with the aftermath of this event, an extraordinary expansion for military, law enforcement, and the intelligence community happened. 2013, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta removed the military's ban on women serving in combat, overturning the 1994 ruling. In 2016, Defense Secretary Ash Carter stated that all military occupations and positions would be open to women. We have come a long way since women were strictly regulated to unpaid, unacknowledged nurses, seamstresses, and at times prostitutes as camp followers. While there is room for improvement within the military, we have come a long way, and this is true even outside the military. This is an adapted and expanded production from a previous presentation. The intent of this presentation is not to degrade the men in the past because of the societal norms of the time and what appears to be aversion to women by doing anything other than maintaining the home, but to show that women can, have, and will overcome the obstacles set before them. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and enlisted under the name of Robert Shurtleff, assigned to a light infantry company. After being wounded, it was discovered that Shurtleff was a woman, and she was discharged. Years later, Congress admitted her claims as a soldier and granted her husband a widow's pension after her death. Sarah Emma Edmonds, U.S. Army, enlisted as Franklin Thompson in the 2nd Michigan Infantry, served as a mail carrier and a spy. Upon suffering injuries, Franklin deserted from the Army. Later, Edmonds served as a nurse using her real name. She even wrote a book titled Memoirs of a Soldier, Nurse, and Spy, A Woman's Adventure in the Union Army. Loretta Velasquez, the Confederate Army. She joined her husband and became known as Lieutenant Harry T. Buford. After her time with the Army, she became a double agent. As an unusual first for women in the military, Captain Sally Tompkins was the first and only woman ever to commission into the Confederate Army. Confederate President Jefferson Davis commissioned her as a captain of cavalry in 1861 to keep the Richmond Hospital running. She was buried with full military honors. Harriet Tubman. Best known for her work with the Underground Railroad, she also served as a Union Army nurse, scout, spy, and soldier. Elizabeth Van Lew, U.S. Army, a Quaker that led a spy network and helped Union soldiers escape from Richmond prisons. Belle Boyd of the Confederate Army. Marie Isabella Belle Boyd was a Confederate spy beginning her work at age 17. In 1861, she shot and killed a drunk Union soldier who insulted her mother. Arrested at least 6 times and finally imprisoned in Washington, D.C. in 1862. Dr. Mary Walker was rejected when she applied as a surgeon to the Army, so she volunteered to be a nurse. She was captured and held prisoner for 4 months, then exchanged for a Southern prisoner. Afterward, she was commissioned as a surgeon. She was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Dr. Walker is still the only woman to be awarded this medal. Cornelia Hancock, U.S. Army, a Quaker and an Army nurse. Susie King Taylor, U.S. Army, a secretly educated 14-year-old slave who served as a literacy teacher to off-duty soldiers, laundress, and nurse's aide. Kathy Williams, U.S. Army, a freed woman and the only documented woman to have served with the Buffalo Soldiers. Dorothea L. Dix. Shortly after the Civil War began, Dix was appointed by the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, as superintendent of women nurses for the Union Army. She ordered and outfitted the Union hospitals and managed roughly 6,000 women. She was the first woman to serve in a high-capacity, federally appointed role. Clara Barton, appointed Lady in Charge of Hospitals of the Army of the James by Major General Benjamin Butler, also known as the Mother of the American Red Cross. Dr. Anita N. McGee, U.S. Army, appointed Acting Assistant Surgeon General, placing her in charge of selecting nurses to work for the Army. Esther Voorhees Hassan, U.S. Navy, served with the Navy on the hospital ship Relief, a ship that was used to evacuate casualties from Cuba. Leila LeBrand, U.S. Marine Corps. She was one of the first 10 women to join the Marines after America entered World War I. She was assigned to the Marines Publicity Bureau. After promotion to the rank of sergeant, she edited newsreels of war footage of Europe and the first military training film, all in a day's work. After her discharge, she managed her daughter, Ginger Rogers' career. Kate Walker, U.S. Lighthouse Service, was 70 years old in 1919. 3 years later, in 1921, Walker and 3 other women lighthouse keepers were awarded the World War I Victory Medal for their service. Merrill Egan Anderson, U.S. Army Signal Corps, one of the telephone operators that became known as the Hello Girls. The Hello Girls were granted veteran services by the GI Bill Improvement Act of 1977, enacted by former President Jimmy Carter. B. Arthur served as a Marine reservist during World War II before going on stage and becoming the beloved Dorothy Zbornak on The Golden Girls. She was at Cherry Point, North Carolina from 1944 to 1945, where her duties included being a driver and a dispatcher. Oveta Culp Hobby requested to assemble a women's support section for the Army. She was the first commander of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. In 1945, Hobby received the Distinguished Service Medal for Outstanding Service. The citation read, "Without guidance or precedence in United States military history to assist her, Colonel Hobby established sound policies and planned and supervised the selection and training of officers and regulations. Her contribution to the war effort of the nation has been of important significance." Jacqueline Cochran became the first woman to win the prestigious Bendix Trophy in 1938. In 1942, she was the head of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, where she oversaw and trained women for flying experimental Air Force planes. Maud Dennison Denny Williams, U.S. Army Nurse Corps. One of 66 Army and 11 Navy nurses taken captive by the Japanese. These nurses could not take care of the military patients, but did care for the other interned civilians at the camp. Her memoir, To the Angels, was published in 1985. Charity Adams Early, U.S. Women's Army Corps. The first African American officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. By the end of the war, she was the highest-ranking African American woman in the Army. Josetta Dermody Wingo, U.S. Navy. Joined the Waves towards the end of the war and taught men how to shoot down enemy aircraft. Senator Margaret Chase Smith, U.S. Air Force. Co-sponsored the WAC bill with Edith N. Rogers after a tour in the Pacific Theater convinced her that Navy nurses needed permanent status. Linda Van Devanter, U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Served for 1 year during Vietnam, and despite what she dealt with when she came home, she continued her nursing career. She founded the Women's Project of the Vietnam Veterans of America and testified before Congress on behalf of women Vietnam veterans. Luann Johnson, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Enlisted into the Navy and 9 years later commissioned into the Marine Corps. She earned the Navy Commendation Medal and Air Force Achievement Award as a journalist, radio, TV broadcaster. After her service, she became a high school teacher and author. Barbara J. Dolinsky, U.S. Marine Corps. The first of 8 female officers and 28 enlisted women in the Marines to serve in Vietnam. She was a top-secret control officer for the Military Assistance Command. Kelly Flynn. In 1995, as an Air Force Academy graduate, she became the first woman B-52 bomber pilot. Commander Darlene Iskra. In 1990, she became the first woman to command a U.S. Navy ship, the USS Opportune. Linda Bray, U.S. Army. She is considered the first woman to lead troops into combat. She commanded the 988th Military Police Company for a deployment to Panama for Operation Just Cause. Mary Ginger Jaycox, U.S. Marine Corps. Her career started in 1974 and had several firsts. She was the first female officer assigned to a combat support operational billet and the first to command a Marine Security Guard battalion. In 2005, Army Sergeant Leanne Hester was awarded the Silver Star for her actions during a firefight that took place outside of Baghdad, the first Silver Star in U.S. military history awarded to a female soldier for direct combat action. In 2007, Army Colonel Stephanie Dawson became the first female brigade commander in the New York Army National Guard. In 2008, Army General Anne E. Dunwoody became the first female four-star general in military history. In 2015, Army Captain Kristen Greist and First Lieutenant Shay Haver became the first women to graduate from Ranger School. August of 2020, Chief Joanne Bass became the first female Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. Annie Wittenmeyer designed a system for feeding soldiers in field hospitals, which is now standard practice in all hospitals. In 1971, Lieutenant Colonel Cheryl Hines Smith became the first woman in the military to stay on active duty status while pregnant and remained in service after the birth of her child. She helped to pave the way for future generations of women in uniform. Mary Kay Hertog, U.S. Air Force, first female top cop and first to make Major General within the Security Forces career field. Emily Thompson became the first woman to fly the F-35A Lightning II in combat. Retired Navy Captain Rosemary Mariner, among the first women to earn her pilot wings in 1974, the first to fly a tactical fighter jet, and the first to command a naval aviation squadron in 1990. Coast Guard Chief Petty Officer Karen Voorhees became the first woman to advance to the rank of Chief Petty Officer since women were allowed in the Coast Guard in 1973. Ensign Matrice Wright became the Navy's first black female naval flight officer. On December 14, 1973, Army privates Joyce Kutch and Rita Johnson became the first women to graduate from basic airborne course. Major General Jean Holm was appointed Director of Women in the Air Force in 1965. She served in this role twice, updated policies, and doubled the number of women in the Air Force. After her retirement, she served as President Ford's Special Assistant in the Office of Women's Programs. Major General Marcelet J. Harris. Commissioned in 1965, she had a variety of assignments. Many of these assignments resulted in firsts for women in the Air Force, like first woman aircraft maintenance officer, one of the first 2 women air officers commanding the U.S. Air Force Academy, and others. Josephine B. Bowman, Navy, obtained the rank of Lieutenant Commander in recognition for her service as Nurse Corps Superintendent. She was the 3rd Superintendent of the Navy Nurse Corps. Esther McGowan Blake, the first woman in the Air Force. Stephanie Czech Rader, Women's Army Corps Office of Special Studies. Recruited for her fluency in Polish, she went undercover in 1945 as an embassy secretary and moved throughout Poland to collect information on Soviet troop movements. Carol Barkalow, U.S. Army. Barkalow was one of the first 118 women admitted to West Point. Master Sergeant Silverine Vineyard James, U.S. Army, an integral part of the desegregation of the armed services. Thank you for watching.